Coming up, the NBA trade deadline passed and all was quiet on the Brooklyn Nets front. I'll dive into the Nets' quiet deadline and what it could mean for the team moving forward after the theme music. What is up, Nets world? We're back here on the Believe in Nets podcast and the Believe Podcast Network. I'm your host, Erik Slater, Brooklyn Nets beat reporter for ClutchPoints.com. But before we get into anything, if you do not already, go subscribe to Believe in Nets wherever you get your podcasts. Most importantly, hit up my YouTube channel at Erik Slater NBA. Subscribe if you enjoy this content, like the video, comment, anything you can do to engage is much appreciated. But on today, we are going to be recapping a quiet Brooklyn Nets trade deadline. I'm going to have NBA insider Jake Fischer on later in the podcast to break down some of what didn't happen for the Brooklyn Nets. But first, I just want to set the scene, what people were expecting, what didn't happen, what did happen at this year's deadline for the rebuilding Nets. And obviously, entering this transaction cycle after the Nets parted with veterans like Dennis Schroeder, like Dorian Finney-Smith, further entrenching themselves into this tank that they committed to when they traded Mikal Bridges this summer, the player everybody's attention had turned to was Cam Johnson, who was the most impactful veteran of that group. He was the one still left on the roster because the Nets were asking for the most, and he also had 2 years left on his contract, something I had, detailed extensively on previous podcasts. And it was getting to a point where the clock was winding down. The Nets had an asking price that I've reported on extensively. They've been asking teams around the league for multiple first-round picks. And when I say asking, I don't mean seeking other teams out. When teams have been coming to the Nets, they have been met with a steep asking price. And it was said to be multiple first-round picks or a first-round pick and a quality young player. And teams were not willing to meet that price. It was getting to a point where they were either going to have to up their offers or the Nets were going to hold on to Cam and live to fight another day this summer, it seems like. And that's what happened. The Nets did not budge on that price, and they held Cam through the trade deadline. And that's something that I heard leading up to this through, people in and around the organization, other teams, that the Nets were sending the signal that they were comfortable holding Cam through the trade deadline. They had no issue doing that. And some people thought it was posturing. Some fans said they thought it was a leverage play. And I said, Sean has shown that he's comfortable doing this in the past with guys like Royce O'Neal and Dorian Finney-Smith. So I totally believed it. And when you look at the transactions that the Nets have made in the past with guys who are, of a similar mold to a guy like Cam Johnson, not a star player like KD or Kyrie or Harden, or not even a guy like Mikal Bridges, who's going to get you the kind of haul that he did. These wing players who are impactful, he's kind of above these other guys I'm going to touch on, like Royce O'Neal and Dorian Finney-Smith. When you look at those guys, Sean Marks has shown that he likes to hold on to these guys. He doesn't like to move off of them until he gets an offer he sees fit. And while the Nets are in a rebuilding situation that's different from some of what they were in with Royce and Dorian and some of those other guys, he's held those guys in until they had, were expiring contracts effectively. And he did that with Dorian when he had, reportedly received an offer of 2 first-round picks, while we don't know, what the protections and where those were coming from at the trade deadline when he acquired Dorian Finney-Smith in 2023. He held on to him all this time until he was effectively an expiring contract. So Sean has a tendency to hold on to these guys, but with this situation with Cam, with him asking for these first-round picks, it was an incentive for trading Cam outside of what you were just going to get back in terms of the return. And it's a reason that a lot of people pointed to him as this obvious trade candidate. And that incentive was obviously bolstering the tank, because Cam has been a player who's having a career best season. He's averaging over 19 points per game. He's leading the NBA in effective field goal percentage among players attempting over 12 field goals and 6 threes per game. And he was having a real impact on the Nets winning. When Cam, wasn't in the lineup, the Nets didn't win a game without him in the lineup until earlier, this week or the week before that. And with him in the lineup, they were on, a 34 or 35 win pace. And a lot of those games they won earlier in the season that have really put them behind the 8 ball in terms of this tank and, receiving top lottery odds were due to Cam Johnson, amongst other guys. But the incentive was trading him, bolstering this tank, trying to make a run at those top lottery odds. And when you look at the lottery landscape at this trade deadline, it's really starting to take shape. And the Nets have put themselves in a position where it really seems like they're going to fall in the 5 or 6 range in terms of the lottery standings at the end of the season. They have teams ahead of them that are, the Hornets are in 4th place. They're 3.5 games ahead of them or 4 games ahead of them. The Pelicans are in 3rd place. They're 5 games ahead of them. And catching those teams teams really seems like it's kind of insurmountable at this point. So while they'll still have to lose games to prevent from falling further, they didn't have the same incentive that they had earlier in the season where, trading Cam was really going to bolster this tank and give them a shot at all these improved odds and all that stuff. It was really becoming more about the return as opposed to improving the tank. And Sean Marks, as I said, had that asking price of 2 first-round picks or a first-round pick and a really impactful young player. And when he didn't receive it, with Cam having 2 years left on his contract, he was willing to hold on to him. So, I would expect them to revisit trade talks in the summer, but also, holding on to Cam is a signal that when you get to the summer, the Nets have 12 tradable first-round picks, top of the league. They have $65 million in cap space, top of the league. All these things they have have been aimed at giving them this flexibility if a star comes available, whether it's Giannis Antetokounmpo or whoever else. When that star comes available, if they want to pivot towards being a competitive team sooner than expected, they have that luxury. And if they are to do that, Cam Johnson is a player you would like to have around, or he could be a player who was in the trade package. So, holding him on to the summer, there is an incentive for that. And while, whether or not they're able to get more, in terms of a return in the summer, more value, they have that luxury where they're going towards the summer, and they might have a situation where they're changing their window, where they're changing this rebuild and how it's going to look. And Cam might be a piece who could play into it when those circumstances change. So, that's how I'm seeing it with Cam. I'm going to dive into that more with Fischer about what the actual, negotiations and teams interested were. But you also want to touch on Nick Claxton and Sharpe, 2 players who thought could be trade candidates. The Lakers, I've reported, had interest in Sharpe earlier in the season. They wanted him to be part of that Dorian Finney-Smith package, but the Nets wanted more draft compensation, and they kind of balked at that. And then the Lakers make the bombshell trade, sending Anthony Davis out the door for Luka Doncic, and they have this glaring hole at center. And some people thought maybe Nick Claxton could be an option there. And, the Lakers make a move. They trade for Mark Williams, and they end up giving up Dalton Connect, Cam Reddish, a first-round pick, and a first-round pick swap, and they go that route. And the reason that I didn't really expect Nick Claxton to be traded at this deadline was because he's not playing well this season, A, and B, he's making $27 million this year. His contract is heavily front-loaded. So when you have a guy who's on a 4-year contract, it's front-loaded, the back end is going to be more attractive. You also don't have to trade him right now because he's not playing well and he has, all those years left. There really was no reason for the Nets to move off from him and what would be effectively selling low on him. They can hold on to him where A, he might be playing better, and B, he's going to be at a much lower contract number that will be easier to move financially in terms of other team matching the money in it. And it'll also be more attractive for teams because he's at a lower number. The last year of Nick Claxton's contract, he's making below 12% of the salary cap. So if he gets back to playing basketball the way that we saw him the previous 2 years, and that's going to maybe put some better pieces around him next year that could improve his play a little bit, he'll be more attracted to other teams and he'll be more movable because his contract is at a lower number. When it comes to Sharpe, he's a guy that has played well of late, and he's an expiring contract. He's going to be a restricted free agent this summer, last year of his rookie deal right now. So he was a guy that some people thought he could. Sean Marks could look to move. He's like to backfill those center positions through the draft. Historically, they have all these first-round picks this year. But, Dayron's a guy who, is showing some promise. The Nets should be able to get him on a good value number contract-wise. And because of that, if they can lock him in on something that's really reasonable, he might be able to outpace that value and, really turn into a guy who they could either want to keep long-term or who could be a really flippable asset if he's able to, continue on a projection that potentially outpaces the number that the Nets are able to lock him in on. So both of those guys, not surprised to see them here. Those are really the only, players that I think people were pointing to as significant trade candidates or guys who could be likely to be moved. Do have one other piece of news. Ben Simmons, the Nets don't make a trade, but they are expected to, make some roster transactions here in the coming days or week. Ben Simmons, league sources have told me rival teams had been monitoring this for a while, but he is expected to negotiate a buyout with the Nets, which is significant for the Nets, who, while I said are unlikely to catch the teams ahead of them in the draft lottery standings, they still have to lose games to maybe give themselves a chance or make sure that they don't fall further in the odds. And while Simmons obviously is nowhere near the level of his Philadelphia 76ers days in terms of what he's doing on the court, he has been a guy that has impacted winning in some games from the Nets this season. And we've seen it with when the Nets immediately traded Dennis Schroeder and when Simmons and D'Angelo Russell and these other guys have been out since, Cam Thomas also out. the quickest way to handicap a roster like the Nets or like any, rebuilding team or any team at all is to take away their ball handling, take away their ability to set up an offense, have structure, functionally run through things. And when you take away Ben Simmons and you take away D'Angelo Russell and Cam Thomas is hurt, the Nets are a far worse basketball team. That's what we saw from them during that, 2-15 stretch. It was that even gave them a shot to get top lottery odds. It was when guys like Cam Thomas has been out that whole time, Russell and Simmons missed extended periods. And, this is a move that I think makes sense for both sides because the Nets are trying to, not totally mess up this tank. And also Simmons is trying to earn a new contract. So him getting to go somewhere else, play meaningful minutes, dare I say, potentially even play playoff minutes for a team. If he can do that and perform well and have an impact, it's going to really benefit him in a way that I don't think he could have if he was to stay on this Nets roster. So, Ben is going to be out the door, it seems like. D'Angelo, I haven't heard anything. It seems like he's staying with the Nets through the season. But with that, Cam Thomas is still out with this hamstring injury. Russell, I think the Nets will sit sporadically, but even when he's, available, they'll have him on the floor. But when he's not in the lineup, they don't have that other ball handler to go to. And they're going to have guys like, Reese Beekman, Tosan Awolomon, Keon Johnson, Tyrese Martin handling the ball. And we've seen that's not a recipe for success. So that's going to benefit the Nets. If you're talking about Simmons' future and where he could potentially go, there's a CBA wrinkle now that does not allow players who are making above the mid-level exception, the non-taxpayer mid-level exception, which is $12.8 million. If your salary is above that and you're a buyout guy, you're not able to sign with apron teams if your previous salary that you were making with the team that bought you out is above that. So Simmons obviously is making $40 million, way above that. He's not going to be able to sign with apron teams, and those teams are the Suns, the Timberwolves, the Celtics, the Knicks, the Lakers, the Bucks, and the Nuggets. So a lot of teams are obviously in contention, but there are teams who are not in that apron situation who are going to have interest in Simmons. Brian Windhorst said it earlier today that the Cavaliers and the Houston Rockets are going to be teams to watch. The Cavs, I think Windhorst said that a couple of weeks ago or a week ago also, and they're a team that makes some sense. They could add some defense, another guy that you could throw at some of these bigger wing guys in the Eastern Conference. So that would make some sense there. The Rockets, obviously third place in the Western Conference. The Clippers are also a team that I think Shams Charania reported who could have some interest. So it seems like Ben's going to land with a team who's, in the playoff picture, and we're going to get to see him play meaningful basketball while healthy in a way that we really didn't get to see throughout this Nets tenure. So it's going to be interesting to see how that shakes out with Ben. Going to take a quick break, and when I come back, I'm going to welcome Jake Fischer, who is, one of the better insiders in the league, to give all the intel that he has on where things stood with the Nets and why they weren't able to get anything done. So be back with Jake after a quick break. And I'm joined now by NBA insider Jake Fischer, the People's Insider, as he likes to call himself. Jake, how you feeling, man? Post trade deadline, how's it feeling over there?
I resent that introduction. The People's Insider nickname was given to me by the people. Okay, I embraced it, accepted it. I wear the crown that they crafted, but I did not make that up. I'm not Kevin Durant calling myself the Slim Reaper or whatever he called himself.
Okay, not the self-appointed People's Insider. Named by the people. But
I'm doing good, dude. I'm doing well. I'm tired. I've had too much coffee. How are you doing?
I'm doing well too. I mean, I don't think my deadline was nearly as eventful as yours, but that's what we're here to talk about. The Brooklyn Nets stand pat at this trade deadline, and I got to give them a little credit because they were the earliest movers, obviously, on the trade deadline with Dennis Schroeder and Dorian Finney-Smith. But it's notable that they stood pat because, leading up to this, I'd say 2-3 weeks ago, a lot of people were pointing to Cam Johnson as maybe even the best player on the trade market, the most, notable or most likely significant guy to be on the move, and the Nets hold on to him. You've done some reporting, so we'll talk about it at length, but just what'd you hear about these Cam Johnson negotiations over the last week and leading into these last couple of days, and what led to the Nets, kind of holding on to him here?
If the question is over the last week, I didn't hear a peep about Cam Johnson, man. Like, never came up outside of me asking, hey, anything new on Cam Johnson? Like, I think there's two kind of avenues, to me, at least in my experience of reporting about this stuff. It's you have things you want to try to find out, right? And then you need to do a good job of listening and kind of taking pulse on what the conversation is around the league and why that conversation is happening from like whatever type of substantive business. So yeah, like I think it's noteworthy that nothing really came up of late. He was a name that I think probably got more attention early on because Brooklyn was very clearly a seller, and the way the trade deadline works, different for the trade market in the summer and when the draft comes up, and even when free agency begins. Like, since it's mid-season, you need to have buyers and sellers. That's just what it is. Like, sure, there are other things where there's teams who like the Rockets being a team that was open to facilitating taking on salary for draft capital. The Rockets are the 3 seed in the West. Like, that's not your standard. Like, there's ways now in this new tax world to do that. But like, for talent to change hands, you need buyers and you need sellers. And the Nets have just been a seller, and such an obvious seller from the get-go. I remember on one of my Bleacher Report video things early on saying, like, very early in December, if you call Brooklyn right now and make them an offer, they'll do a deal. And like they did, right? They moved Dennis Schroeder the second business opened. So because of all that, because they of course then make the Dorian Finney-Smith move not too long after, I think all these teams having all this conversation with Brooklyn, you're not just calling Brooklyn about Dennis Schroeder. You're first calling Brooklyn if you're Golden State, or if you're the Lakers calling on Dorian Finney-Smith, and you're saying, hey, like, who do you like on our roster, blah, 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 blah. And so Cam Johnson's name, of course, just got included in all that. But hindsight being 2020, he was clearly not the same type of trade candidate compared to Dennis and compared to DFS, because he's younger. He's got multiple years on his deal. All those years are descending. There's other things with fit and culture and yada yada, but like Dennis and Dodo are both past 30 and essentially expiring contracts when you consider the prevailing thought Finney-Smith is gonna decline his player option and look for a new deal. So don't think he was really necessarily the same type of trade candidate as those two guys really all along.
And when you say that, are you saying that teams kind of got that vibe, or in those early discussions where maybe his name was thrown into those Schroeder DFS conversations, got the vibe that the Nets weren't really, I don't know if would be negotiating in good faith, or the asking price wasn't going to be reasonable, compared to what those other guys were. So, is that what you're kind of saying, that maybe there would have been interest, but the Nets weren't in a position where they were really even looking to sell him?
They definitely were listening. And I think if, like, one thought experiment that maybe I will even pitch people in the franchise, would you take what the Raptors gave up for Brandon Ingram for Cam Johnson? Because that general valuation is what it sounded like Brooklyn was asking for teams for Cam. The equivalent of 2 first-round picks, or first plus stuff, plus good stuff. And like, to me, I would consider Bruce Brown good stuff. Like, he's someone that a lot of teams wanted on the buyout market. Doesn't sound like he's getting bought out right now. And, to me, there's some interesting value in like getting him at 23 million in the door right now, but being able to keep him on your books, maybe more around the mid-level on a new deal this summer kind of thing. But never really just seemed like Brooklyn got that type of evaluation for Cam, being that teams that were interested in him, like Cleveland, that was my Freudian slip that I was building to. Like, the Cavs didn't want to trade their 1 first-round pick, and look, they didn't trade a first-round pick in the DeAndre Hunter deal that they ended up making happen today. So, I mean, the Kings, I don't think they really wanted to come. I mean, every time I talked to Sacramento loosely about Cam Johnson, even, it was just like, man, yeah, Brooklyn, their price is too high. So to like really answer your question, does that mean Brooklyn was just setting an absurdly high price that they knew no one was going to beat? No, I think there was potentially a world that someone was just like, man, we're a Cam Johnson away. But that probably only happens if he also is not in and out of the lineup with ankle injuries and stuff like that, where he's had injury questions his entire career. He got medically red flagged by a lot of teams coming out of UNC with like a hip thing, if I recall correctly.
Yep.
So, yeah, I think that was as much of a detriment as anything too. Like, he hasn't played in how long on a consistent basis too?
Yeah, well, he was healthy earlier in the season, and then he's had this ankle thing that's kind of lingered, and the Nets finally shut him down during this last week. He missed 6 games, and then he came back and played in the Washington game last night, which I
He
thought
did play. Okay, see,
played
I have
last
no
night.
idea what happened in the NBA since Saturday at 12:15.
Yeah.
Well, on an on-court basis, I know De'Aaron Fox debuted last night. I know that. That's about it. Yeah, so I think the
Yeah.
health thing. I mean, there was multiple times over this last 6-week stretch where I was going to Barclays Center looking to interview Cam Johnson, and he had gotten hurt the night before, and like I couldn't talk to him anymore. So other teams picked up on that too.
So when you're having these conversations with teams around the league, maybe even earlier in the year, who might have had some interest in Cam Johnson, were you able to get a sense of what some of these teams might view as what would be fair value? Obviously, I've reported, and you just said that the Nets have been looking for what they would say is the equivalent of 2 first-round picks, and obviously that asking price was not met. But what do you get a sense that other teams would say is fair value, if and when likely the Nets revisit conversations like this in the summer?
I think more so like a first, I think if we get to draft night and a team's trading like a late lottery pick for him or a pick at 16, 17, 18, like I wouldn't be surprised if they got those types of calls. But anything in the 2 range, I just don't see. I mean, look, the Lakers just turned right around and turned a first and a swap into Mark Williams. But right now, the fact that Luka Doncic only got 1 first-round pick is just going to be something that is in the water. Like,
well, let me ask you about that, because that's interesting, because we see all these teams, and I want to stay on Cam, but this is just, I've wanted to ask somebody about this for a while, and we see all these deals happen, like the Rudy Gobert deal happens, and then the McHale deal happens, and it seems like after everyone, people are like, oh, like this is going to reset the market. People are going to be asking for this. Now Luka Doncic goes for 1 first-round pick, and obviously Anthony Davis, but like,
and Max Christie, respect to Max Christie.
I mean, it's absolutely insane that the Hornets deal Mark Williams, and they're like, okay, we'll get the 31 first, which people probably think is gonna be more valuable, and we'll get the 30 swap. And like, the Mavs, who are trading a top 3 player in the NBA, can't get that. So do you think that deal, or just deals in general, like people reset expectations of what these pick values are for player, or do you think some of them are just viewed as outliers?
This is viewed as an outlier. It's not going to impact. It's not going to impact stuff. I'm just saying that joke is going to be made on the phone from GM to GM, assistant GM to assistant GM, and like, look, we're not going to trade 2 firsts for Cam Johnson if Luke only got 1. Like that type of stuff. That barb is going to be there. People are going to have that in their pocket, ready to toss it out very quickly. So yeah, look, if the Suns were going to move Kevin Durant, from what I gathered, without being too specific, like they were asking for multiple firsts to get it done, and they didn't move him. So I don't think, to like answer that question with a comparable situation, not a hypothetical, like I don't think Luka Doncic only going for a first made the Phoenix Suns suddenly not have a very high bar to move Kevin freaking Durant, Yeah.
All right. And you've done some reporting. Obviously, like there are the obvious teams that you would think would have interest. Obviously, contenders looking to bolster their rotation, add a shooter, have interest in Cam Johnson. What are some of the teams that you heard, early on or even closer to this? I know it was quiet, but any teams that you heard that might have been willing to make a serious run at CJ?
Definitely Sac. Sac seemed like the team that was really at the front of the line for him. I think also just because there, when you're looking at trade math, try to figure out a possible deal, there are just certain scenarios where it's like there's really only 2 or 3 things a team can do anyway. And like Sac has just been, they've had this Kevin Herter, Trey Lyles outgoing money in the air for a long time, and like Kevin Herter, when his money goes out the door in the Zach LaVine, De'Aaron Fox 3-team deal, like not a surprise to Kevin Herter himself, people around the league, So I think because that package was there and the Kings were willing to do a first, that is just kind of, and like the fact that Brooklyn didn't just say yes to that right away. I think that was known around the league as like a rough idea, something that was a hypothetical benchmark that you would have to beat in order to get him in theory. So that was the largest. I mean, I hadn't really heard many developments since then.
So that
And
was Herter Lyles, you were saying, in a first was what the Kings were offering?
something to that effect, something plus or minus whatever, with protections or whatnot. Yeah.
Okay.
That was what I was hearing would have been the deal if it was Sack. I don't know if they like firmly offered that and Brooklyn declined it or whatever, but yeah.
And that was like a deterrent, you think, after that they were, being as stingy as they were about it, the Nets end?
No, I don't want to like directly characterize like stingy. I don't know. I just know there was never any real urgency. Yeah. But Indiana, we heard people. I mean, I think both Brooklyn and Memphis were wondering if there was going to be a revisitation there after the Dorian stuff, but I never thought anything got rekindled to say that. Golden State had talked about him, but then once the Dennis deal was done, I think that was just kind of it. After the Warriors were a team, for example, that I remember talking to them about it at the showcase, saying like, yeah, they just want a lot for Cam. So those are, I mean, there really wasn't that. I mean, I remember someone wrote Orlando and like people were wondering about Orlando. Never got that confirmed. I mean, it could have been a thing, but I never heard Orlando from like people primarily involved. But yeah, we'll hear about him again. Like
I mean, the Nets, he has the 2 years left on his contract, obviously, and the Nets are, Sean Marks has shown, I feel like, through with DFS and Royce O'Neal and other guys that, he holds on to these guys, and he obviously often has a high asking price. And if it's not meant, he's comfortable holding on to them. So it seems like stuff will be revisited with CJ. Wanted to, just touch on a couple other guys quick before maybe getting into some big picture stuff. Nick Claxton and Day'Ron Sharpe, the Nets centers, particularly guys that people thought maybe could be on the move. Obviously, Sharpe, a lower level guy, and Nick, a guy who's not having a great year, but has shown he could be a defensive player of the year, caliber player in the past. So anything you heard on those two guys on the transaction front?
Claxton's name, like, never really came up for me. Day'Ron, there was some talk just because his salary's low and that any team could have acquired him, but like I never really heard. I know there was some hope that maybe he would have gotten moved, but both those guys, it was relatively quiet. Like I definitely heard way more about Jericho Sims and Gershon Yabusele and Daniel Tice of like those $2 million range, kind of vet minimum exception caliber of salary guys. I was asking about Day'Ron Sharpe. People were asking about me or asking me about him because I'm Brooklyn based. But I mean, I'm sure there was some type of activity calls about him, whatever. But yeah, I never got a good sense that there was like he was going to get moved. Like we really did think that Jericho. Like I talked about it with Fred Katz on his show, whenever that was, Monday. I don't know. And we both like our final prediction of what the Knicks were going to do is turn Jericho Sims into something. I thought it'd be a different center. It ends up being DeLon Wright, but like I never had a firm thought that Day'Ron Sharpe was going to get moved. And Claxton, look, you don't typically get traded when you have long-term money and you're having a down season. That's just what it is.
And on that note, for CJ, for Claxton, for these guys, in the offseason, it seems like Claxton's probably a guy that'll hold longer. But CJ in particular, if they revisit these talks in the summer, how do you, in your experience when you cover these types of trades, how does, trade conversations and, just how does the business side of it differ from when you're doing a mid-season trade to when you go into the offseason and some of these things are revisited? Do you think that it's a situation where, CJ gets into the offseason and the landscape might look a little different? Or is it, you can't predict fully, but just at large, how do those things typically differ?
Number one, your availability and your capability of impacting a team's playoff run right now is off the board, right? It's all about projection. And you're also like in the summer, a lot of teams are reacting to what their shortcomings were in the postseason. So like the most famous example I always talk about is the fact that the Timberwolves got absolutely out rebounded and demolished by Brandon Clark in that series against Memphis a couple years ago. And they turned around and traded the farm for Rudy Gobert. So
Yeah.
with Cam, I mean, any team that
Look for a
just
team that's
realizes,
bricklaying in
any team that doesn't have enough shooting, like he'll be one of the first names that they put on their board. It's not complicated, you know. And then he'll have 2 years left instead of 2.5. And I think also just in general speaking, like there being more roster spots available, you can carry up to 20 players in the offseason. That just allows for more optionality. So that's really it. I mean, and also it can happen over a general course of time. Like a lot of trade talks start around the combine again in earnest. When everyone combine. I don't know, sorry, I just got a text and I got distracted. When when everyone convenes in Chicago for like a week plus, and there's agents there and teams. Once the draft order gets set, like all that type of stuff starts to get picked back up, and then you know there's things that could and could not get done during the draft, and that sets the stage for free agency right after. So there's a lot of momentum, like from all of those things. Like there's more of a window with more deadlines, right? Like when December 15th happens, these guys are just eligible. Like most business in the NBA gets done when there's a deadline. Like, and that's not just trades. Like there's a deadline to sign rookie scale extension guys in the fall, right? You can start that July 7th or whatever it is, and like the overwhelming majority of those don't get done until the last night before because deadlines create activity. This is a very what's the word? I'm brain dead. The P word for being for delaying things. Procrastinate. There's a lot of procrastination in NBA business. So the fact that the draft is like a deadline, like for example, if you're a team that has the 17th pick or whatever, and you're trying to go acquire veteran talent with it, like the time you're off the clock, those 5 minutes are done in the 7th, like that is a deadline, you know, to do something. So there's a lot of pressure to make a diamond come to reality on draft night, and then that spurs up a lot of stuff, and then business ends. You can still kind of do some dealing, but then like the free agency horn sounds right after that. So there's a lot of momentum to do a bunch of stuff compared to now, where you don't necessarily even have to do anything. It's mid-season. We'll see how this year unfolds. Kind of laissez-faire approach sometimes.
And, we'll close it out with a little bit of a big picture, talk on the Nets. When you look at the deals that they made previously, when they dealt Schroeder, when they dealt DFS, they were looking for expiring money, and the cap space that they have, obviously the number of first round picks that they have a lot of optionality in this rebuild and how they can play it out, whether they want to make a leap towards contention sooner, whether a star becomes available, whether they play it out longer and tank next season. When you talk to people around the league, just what's the sense you get about the Nets situation as a whole in terms of, how they could potentially play this out, and particularly that $65 million in cap space at league leading? I think the Wizards got up to maybe like 30 with what they did at this deadline, but obviously the Nets are head and shoulders above everybody else there. So when you talk around the league, what they could be preparing to do, what their, intentions could be, what are some of the stuff you're hearing?
A big difference between Brooklyn and Washington too. And I don't think the Nets are going to try to go. Everything I have learned leads me to believe the Nets are not like trying to recreate 2019 all over again. But I don't think the Nets have as long a view as the Wizards have. I think the Wizards are going to be building this thing much more incrementally than Brooklyn sees for themselves. So yeah, like they're definitely still a team that the league is looking at to be a real player in restricted free agency. Like, look, Jonathan Kuminga's name was definitely brought up in trade conversations for Kevin Durant. He knows that. Like, is he a name they go after? Santi Aldama is still going to be available. I'm not saying he's a Nets guy, but I'm just throwing out another, what happens with Memphis. They just made a lot of financial moves to be focused on that flexibility, but that type of stuff, restricted free agency stuff, I think people are wondering if they're going to be a factor in, especially because that was a big hallmark of this front office back before 2019, right? The Allen Crabs, the Tyler Johnsons, the Otto Porters. We'll see.
What would you say to Nets fans after seeing the Suns debacle of a deadline, pining for a Kevin Durant reunion by a trade? Not any intel, but what would you say to that idea? Or you think about the likelihood of something like that? If he seems like, based on how, I mean, I tweeted that I think the Suns have been a masterclass of how to not manage a roster, over these last 2 years, and it seems like KD could be trending towards a departure there this summer.
If he does leave, which does seem more likely than not right now, I don't think he wants to go to a rebuilding situation. He's 35 years old. I think educated guesses would be pushing me to think that it would be a Houston or a Dallas or a Minnesota or I mean, he didn't want to go to Golden State now, but maybe that would change. Yeah.
All right, Nets fans, you heard it here. Jake, I appreciate you coming on and taking the time after this busy deadline. Tell everybody where they can find your work just so they can, see everything you're doing.
Yeah. The Stein line, markstein.substack.com. Please subscribe. Bleacher Report doing video stuff there. Now back down to once a week, but we'll ramp it back up as we get to the draft and free agency and all that too.
All right, appreciate it, man. Hope to see you at Barclays soon, and I hope you get some rest later on tonight.
I plan to. I'm gonna veg out right now, man.
All right, I'll see you soon, man.
Later.
That does it for this episode of Believe in Nets on the Believe Podcast Network, your one-stop shop for everything happening across the sports and entertainment world. Hope you guys enjoyed the talk with Jake. Anything we get on the Nets quiet trade deadline, but trying to get any information we can. As I said at the top, if you don't already, subscribe to Believe in Nets wherever you get your podcasts, Apple Podcasts, Spotify. Hit up my YouTube channel at Erik Slater NBA. Like, comment, subscribe, anything you can do to engage. You guys can find all my work on clutchpoints.com, constant news, updates, analysis. You can follow me on Twitter at Erik Slater _ live game tweets, interview clips, all that. Past the trade deadline, we're heading towards some buyout stuff potentially with Ben Simmons, and then it'll really get into more draft positioning and then even, breakdowns of some of the prospects. I'll have all that here on Believe in Nets as the season progresses. Talk to you guys soon.